October 24th, 1942, 2:30 a.m., Guadalcanal. Sergeant John Basilone is kneeling in the mud behind a Browning M1917 machine gun. The barrel is so hot, he can smell the oil burning off the steel. His hands are blistered. Through the darkness, you can hear them coming, again. The sound starts as a low rustle in the elephant grass. Then the screaming begins. Banzai, banzai. 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the elite Sendai Division are charging straight at his position. They are running over the bodies of the men who charged at midnight. They are climbing over their own dead like stepping stones across a river. Basilone presses the trigger. Red tracers slice through the rain. Somewhere in the jungle, Japanese General Harukichi Hayakutake is awaiting for a victory signal. He has 15,000 men. He has tanks. He has the backing of the Imperial Navy. He is certain that by sunrise, the American flag will be gone. He is wrong. In the next 72 hours, the attack on Henderson Field will become one of the most lopsided defeats in history. Japan's finest combat unit is walking into a meat grinder, and they don't even know it. Guadalcanal was a lush green nightmare. It is a volcanic island in the Solomon Chain. It is 90 miles long and 25 miles wide. In 1942, it was mostly uncharted. It was covered in dense rainforests and jagged ridges. The climate was oppressive. The humidity hovered near 90%. The temperature rarely dropped below 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Disease was everywhere. In May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, saw the island's potential. They identified a flat plain at Lunga Point. This area was perfect for a runway. It was free of the swampy terrain that defined the rest of the coast. The Japanese began construction immediately. They used nearly 3,000 workers. This group included the 11th and 13th construction units. They used primitive tools and hand labor. They cleared the tall kunai grass. The objective was simple. A Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal would change the Pacific map. It would put Japanese bombers within range of New Caledonia. It would allow them to strike the supply lines between the United States and Australia. This was a strategic dagger aimed at the Allied throat. The Americans could not let this happen. Admiral Ernest King and Admiral Chester Nimitz launched Operation Watchtower. This was the first major Allied offensive of the war. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division arrived. The Marines caught the Japanese by surprise. The defenders at Lunga Point were mostly laborers. They fled into the jungle. Within 36 hours, the Marines captured the airfield. They found it nearly complete. They renamed it Henderson Field. It was named in honor of Major Lofton Henderson. He was a Marine aviator who died at the Battle of Midway. The Cactus Air Force was born. Tokyo was in shock. They did not believe the Americans were capable of an offensive. They viewed the landings as a small reconnaissance force. They expected to retake the island in a week. The first response was the Ichiki detachment. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 900 men. He did not wait for his full force. On August 21st, he charged the Marine lines at the Tinaro River. The result was a massacre. The Marines used M1917 water-cooled machine guns. They used canister shot from 37mm anti-tank guns. Almost the entire Japanese force was wiped out. Tokyo doubled down. They sent the 35th Infantry Brigade. This group was led by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. In mid-September, he attacked a ridge south of the airfield. This became the Battle of Edson's Ridge. Again, the Japanese failed. They lost 800 men in a single night of banzai charges. The Marines held the high ground. The spirit of the Japanese bayonet was no match for American artillery. After this defeat, Japan finally understood the stakes. They decided to stop sending small units. They decided to send a sledgehammer. This sledgehammer was the 17th Army. It was commanded by Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakutake. He shifted his focus from New Guinea to Guadalcanal. Hayakutake selected the elite 2nd Infantry Division. This unit was known as the Sendai Division. It was one of the oldest and most prestigious units in the IGA. The Tokyo Express began. This was a fleet of Japanese destroyers. They moved at night to avoid American planes. By October, the Sendai Division was on the island. They brought heavy artillery and tanks. General Hayakutake arrived on October 9th. He was confident. He saw 15,000 elite troops ready for battle. He saw 11,000 exhausted Marines in a shrinking perimeter. He did not know the Marines had been reinforced. He did not know that they had the 164th Infantry Regiment. He did not know the airfield was protected by a sophisticated network of fire zones. Hayakutake planned a three-pronged assault. The main force would come from the south. The stage was set. The Sendai Division began its march. They moved into the deep jungle. They were heading toward a meeting with destiny. Between the Sendai and their objective lay 15 miles of jungle. This was the first mistake in a chain of disasters. The Maruyama Trail was about to claim its first victims. The 2nd Infantry Division was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army. It was known as the Sendai Division. It was named after the city in northern Japan where its soldiers were recruited. These men were not green recruits. They were hardened veterans of the Dutch East Indies campaign. They had captured Java with lightning speed earlier in 1942. The Sendai was one of the IGA's elite divisions. It was a square division consisting of 4 infantry regiments. These were the 4th, 16th, 29th, and 230th Infantry Regiments. The division was commanded by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama. Maruyama was a firm believer in Japanese spiritual power. He believed that a night bayonet charge could overcome any amount of firepower. This was a core tenet of Japanese military doctrine. It was called seishin. It emphasized the superior willpower of the Japanese soldiers over materialistic Western armies. The Sendai Division did not come alone. They brought the first independent tank company. This unit was led by Captain Maeda. The company was equipped with 10 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks. It also had several Type 95 Hago light tanks. These were the best armored vehicles Japan had to offer. Hayakutake also landed heavy artillery. He brought the 4th Heavy Artillery Regiment. This included 150mm howitzers and 100mm cannons. The Japanese plan for the October offensive was complex. It relied on perfect coordination between 3 different forces. The first was the Sumiyoshi Force. This group would attack across the Montanakau River from the west. It consisted of about 2,900 men and all the tanks. Their job was to act as a diversion. The second force was the Oka Force. This was led by Colonel Akinosuke Oka. They would attack from the southwest near the foothills of the mountains. The third and largest force was the Maruyama Group. This was the main sledgehammer. It consisted of nearly 7,000 men. Maruyama planned to bypass the Marine front lines. He wanted to march deep into the jungle. He wanted to strike the airfield from the south where defenses were thin. The Japanese intelligence was faulty. They estimated the Americans had only 10,000 troops. In reality, the Marines and Army units totaled over 23,000. Maruyama also underestimated the terrain. He looked at a map and saw a blank green space. He assumed his men could cut a trail through it in 2 days. He called this the Maruyama Trail. It was a 15-mile route through some of the densest terrain on the planet. There were no roads. There were no paths. Maruyama ordered his men to carry everything on their backs. Each soldier carried an extra shell for the artillery. They carried heavy machine guns and mortars. They were forbidden from using machetes or axes. Maruyama feared the sound would alert the American patrols. They had to push through the vines and mud by hand. The Sendai Division stepped into the jungle on October 16th. They carried only a few days' worth of rations. They expected a quick march and a glorious victory. The jungle had other plans. The invincible veterans were about to meet an enemy they couldn't bayonet. They were about to be swallowed by the green hell. The march was the beginning of the end. It was the first link in a chain of logistical failures. The Maruyama Trail was turning into a graveyard of supplies. General Maruyama stood at the edge of the jungle. He held a map that was mostly blank. His objective was the southern edge of Henderson Field. He decided to avoid the coastal road entirely. He knew American ships and planes controlled the water. He chose the indirect approach through the interior. He ordered his men to cut a path through the untouched wilderness. This was the birth of the Maruyama Trail. It was 15 miles of vertical green hell. The Sendai Division entered the brush on October 16th. The division was used to quick victories in Java, but they were not prepared for the Solomon Islands. The vines were like thick steel wire. The mud was knee-deep and smelled of rot. There were no pack animals available for this route. Every soldier was turned into a beast of burden. Infantrymen carried their Arisaka rifles and full combat kits. They also carried the heavy components of the division's support weapons. Teams of 4 men struggled to carry a single Type 92 heavy machine gun. Teams of 10 men hauled the disassembled parts of mountain guns. The most brutal task was the ammunition. Soldiers carried 75 millimeter and 150 millimeter artillery shells on their backs. These shells weighed between 15 and 90 pounds each. They were tied to the soldiers' bodies with vines or ropes. The hills were nearly vertical. The men had to crawl on their hands and knees to climb. They pulled themselves up the slopes by gripping tree roots. The heat was a physical weight on their shoulders. Sweat washed away their salt and their strength. Maruyama had forbidden the use of machetes or axes. He wanted total silence to achieve a surprise attack. Men had to pull the jungle vines apart with their bare hands. This slowed the march to a crawl. The division was making less than 1 mile per day. The invasion schedule was already falling apart. By the second day, the rations were running dangerously low. The men were eating only a handful of rice every 24 hours. Then the rain started. Guadalcanal is one of the wettest places on earth during the monsoon. The trail turned into a slide of slick, red clay. Exhaustion became a gateway for disease. Men began to collapse from malaria and beriberi. Dysentery swept through the ranks like a wildfire. The jungle was literally eating the Sendai Division. Maruyama made a desperate decision on the trail. He ordered the heavy artillery to be abandoned. The 150 millimeter howitzers were sinking into the mud up to their axles. The men left the big guns in a deep ravine. They only kept the light 75 millimeter mountain guns. This was the turning point of the entire operation. The Japanese were heading toward a fortress without their own heavy fire support. They were losing their teeth before they reached the fight. General Hyakutake was waiting at the coast for a progress report. He expected Maruyama to be in position by October 22nd, but Maruyama was still lost in the Green Labyrinth. The coordination of the entire 17th Army began to fracture. The soldiers were no longer elite veterans. They were starving, shivering, and hollow-eyed men. They were struggling just to survive the walk to the battlefield. Their spiritual power was being drained by the mud of the Solomon Islands. The Maruyama Trail was a logistical suicide note. By the time they reached the American perimeter, the men were half dead. They had no heavy guns to counter the Marine artillery. They had no food left in their packs. They had only their bayonets and their desperation. This choice ensured the assault would be a one-sided slaughter. Timing is the most fragile weapon in any war. General Hyakutake's plan relied on a clock that did not exist. The assault was supposed to be a synchronized hammer blow. The Sumiyoshi force would strike from the west at the Matanakau River. The Maruyama force would strike from the south at the exact same moment. Hyakutake set the original H hour for the evening of October 22nd. But the jungle does not care about military schedules. Maruyama was still miles away from his jump-off point. He sent a radio message to headquarters requesting a 24-hour delay. The attack was rescheduled for October 23rd. But communication in the Solomon Islands was a disaster. The Japanese radios were weak, and the mountain terrain blocked the signals. General Sumiyoshi, waiting in the west, received the message. General Maruyama, struggling in the south, believed everyone was ready. But the two forces were essentially blind to each other's progress. On the evening of October 23rd, the western diversion began. Major General Sumiyoshi ordered his artillery to open fire. He sent the 1st Independent Tank Company across the sandbar at the mouth of the Matanakau. Colonel Nakaguma led 9 Type 97 medium tanks and 2 Type 95 light tanks. They roared across the open sand toward the Marine lines. They expected the southern attack to be hitting the airfield right then. They expected the Marines to be distracted and panicked. They were wrong. The southern forest was silent. Maruyama's men were still tripping over roots in the dark. The Marines of the 1st and 7th Regiments were waiting at the river. They had clear lines of sight across the sand. They had zeroed in their 37mm anti-tank guns. As the Japanese tanks emerged, the Marines opened fire with terrifying precision. The 37mm rounds punched through the thin Japanese armor like paper. One tank was hit in the tracks and spun in circles. Another took a direct hit to the turret and exploded. The infantry following the tanks were caught in a storm of machine gun fire. The Marines used canister shot, which turns an anti-tank gun into a giant shotgun. Within minutes, the entire tank company was a collection of burning scrap metal. Nakaguma's men were slaughtered on the sandbar. It was a total failure of the western diversion. Because the southern force hadn't arrived, the Marines could focus 100% of their fire on the river. Sumiyoshi had sacrificed his armor for nothing. Meanwhile, General Maruyama was finally approaching the southern perimeter. He saw the flashes of the western artillery in the distance. He realized he was late. He pushed his starving men to move faster through the final miles of brush. But they were moving into a trap they couldn't see. The Marines had used the delay to reinforce the southern line. General Vandergrift had moved his reserves to the very spot Maruyama was targeting. The coordination paradox had handed the advantage to the Americans. The Japanese were attacking in pieces, and the Marines were ready to break those pieces one by one. The southern slaughter was about to begin. General Vandergrift understood the geography of Henderson Field perfectly. He lacked enough men to form a solid, continuous line around the entire airfield. Instead, he established the Lunga perimeter. This was a semicircle of fortified strong points separated by defensive gaps. The Marines dug deep foxholes and reinforced them with heavy coconut logs. They created the surrounding jungle growth to create open killing zones. Interlocking fields of fire were the backbone of this defense. This meant every inch of ground was covered by at least 2 separate machine guns. The Marines used miles of barbed wire to funnel attackers into these predetermined zones. The wire was often hung with empty ration cans to act as primitive tripwire alarms. One of the most lethal tools in the perimeter was the M3 37mm anti-tank gun. While designed for tanks, the Marines used it primarily as an anti-personnel weapon. They used a specific type of ammunition called canister shot. A canister shell is essentially a massive shotgun shell filled with hundreds of steel balls. When fired, it shreds everything within a 100-yard cone. It was capable of clearing a path through dense grass and human formations instantly. Behind the front lines sat the 11th Marine Artillery Regiment. They were equipped with M2A1 105mm howitzers. These guns were the heavy hitters of the Cactus defense. Marine observers had spent weeks zeroing in their sights on the jungle edge. They had pre-calculated the coordinates for every clearing and forest trail. This process is known as pre-registration of fire. It meant they could drop high explosive shells on a specific target in seconds. The gunners did not need to adjust their aim during the heat of the night. Communication was handled by a massive network of buried field phone wires. This was far more reliable than the failing Japanese radio systems. On October 13th, the Marines received a massive boost in manpower. The 164th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army arrived on the island. They were the first Army unit to join the ground fight on Guadalcanal. They brought fresh troops and a significant technological advantage. The 164th was armed with the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle. Most Marines at the time were still using the bolt-action M1903 Springfield. The Garand allowed a soldier to fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. The volume of fire the perimeter could produce was suddenly doubled. Vandergrift placed the 164th in reserve, ready to plug any hole in the line. He was a master of using interior lines for his defense. Because the airfield was in the center, he could move troops to any side of the circle quickly. The Japanese had to move through miles of jungle just to change their position. Vandergrift had turned Henderson Field into a modern industrial fortress. It was a trap designed to absorb a massive frontal assault and destroy it with math and lead. Maruyama's men were marching toward a wall of fire they could not comprehend. The stage was set for the night of October 24th. The thin line was about to be tested by the elite of the Emperor's army. The rain fell in sheets on the night of October 24th. It was a blinding, tropical downpour that turned the jungle floor into a liquid swamp. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller held a defensive sector nearly 2,500 yards long. He had only his 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines to cover this massive gap. This was the most vulnerable part of the southern Lunga perimeter. Behind him lay the virtual runway of Henderson Field. In front of him were 3,000 elite soldiers of the Japanese 2nd Division. The Japanese had finally emerged from the agonizing Maruyama Trail. They were starving and exhausted, but their bayonets were fixed and their resolve was absolute. At 9:30 p.m., the first Japanese scouts tripped the American wire. Empty ration cans rattled in the darkness. Then the jungle exploded with the sound of thousands of voices. The Sendai Division charged in massed human waves. They hit the center of the 7th Marines line with terrifying force. Puller's men opened fire with every weapon they possessed. The pitch-black night was suddenly illuminated by the constant flash of muzzle blasts. Puller realized his line was too thin to withstand a concentrated breakthrough. He radioed for immediate reinforcements from the Army's 164th Infantry. Colonel Bryant Moore responded without hesitation. He sent the 3rd Battalion of the 164th into the hearts of the fight. The Army soldiers had to move through the blackness toward the deafening roar of the guns. They did not have the time to form a second, supporting line. They literally jumped into the mud-filled foxholes alongside the Marines. It became a chaotic, integrated defense. A Marine would fire his bolt-action Springfield, while an Army soldier reloaded his semi-automatic M1 Garand. The Japanese were funneled into the barbed wire entanglements by the hundreds. They were cut down in the predetermined killing zones by the volume of American fire. Some Japanese soldiers managed to reach the very edge of the American parapets. The fighting dissolved into a nightmare of bayonets, knives, and clubbed rifles. The American used grenades to clear the dead and dying from the space just feet from their holes. By midnight, the ground in front of the line was a literal carpet of Japanese bodies. The Sendai commanders refused to halt or pivot the direction of the attack. They sent wave after wave into the same wall of lead and steel. Chesty Puller walked his lines in the rain, encouraging his men and correcting their aim. The thin line was bending under the weight of the assault, but it would not break. The night of October 24th was the ultimate test of American infantry resolve. The Japanese possessed the superior numbers, but the Americans possessed the superior fire discipline. The assault was a head-on collision between 19th century spirit and 20th century technology. The slaughter was far from over. One man in particular was about to become the embodiment of this mechanical destruction. Sergeant John Basilone was at the center of the storm. He commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns. His weapon of choice was the M1917 Browning machine gun. This was a water-cooled, belt-fed weapon firing 30 .06 caliber rounds. It was designed for one thing: sustained, relentless fire. The M1917 featured a large steel jacket around the barrel filled with water. As the gun fired, the heat from the barrel was absorbed by the liquid. This allowed the weapon to fire thousands of rounds without the barrel melting or warping. The Japanese machine guns were primarily air-cooled. They had to fire in short bursts to prevent the metal from failing. Basilone did not have that limitation. The Japanese 2nd Division charged in thick, dark clusters through the rain. They used the tall grass for cover until they were only 30 yards away. Basilone saw them only when his own muzzle flashes illuminated the jungle. The water in the gun jackets began to boil under the intensity of the fight. Steam whistled out of the overflow tubes like a pressure cooker. Basilone's crews were firing until their belts were empty. Suddenly, a nearby gun position was silenced by a Japanese mortar strike. The Japanese began to pour through the resulting gap in the line. Basilone realized the entire perimeter was seconds away from a total collapse. He grabbed his heavy machine gun and its tripod. He ran through the open mud while the Japanese fired at his shadow. He set the gun up in the new hole and began raking the jungle edge. The gun jammed in the middle of a screaming bonsai charge. He did not have time to use his cleaning rod or his tools. He cleared the blockage using his bare hands. The heat of the metal burned his palms and fingers to the bone. He did not stop. He continued to fire until the next belt was spent. When his men ran out of ammunition, Basilone disappeared into the dark. He fought his way back to the supply dump through Japanese infiltrators. He carried 2 heavy ammo boxes on his shoulders back to the front line. The volume of the fire he maintained created a mechanical wall of lead. The Japanese bonsai tactic relied on a pause in the firing for the enemy to reload. But with water-cooled guns and Basilone's ammo runs, the fire never stopped. His machine guns stripped the bark from the trees. They turned the grass into a field of red-stained mud. By 3 a.m., Basilone's guns were the only things speaking in his sector. He had single-handedly held a gap that would have let the Japanese reach the runway. His iron hands had broken the momentum of the elite Sendai Division. The technical superiority of the M1917 was the deciding factor in the darkness. It proved that human bravery is no match for a machine that never overheats. The night was finally fading. The jungle was about to reveal the true cost of Maruyama's failure. The sun rose over the Lunga perimeter on October 26th. The rain had finally stopped. The jungle air was thick with the smell of wet earth and copper. The Marines and soldiers of the 164th stood up from their foxholes. They looked out over the fields of kunai grass. What they saw was a scene of industrial-scale slaughter. The ground in front of Chesty Puller's sector was invisible. It was completely covered by the bodies of the Sendai Division. In some places, the Japanese dead were piled 3 or 4 deep. They were tangled in the barbed wire like discarded rags. The 37mm canister shot had stripped the leaves from every tree for 50 yards. The American burial details began the grim task of counting the fallen. They found over 2,200 Japanese bodies in the immediate vicinity of the perimeter. This was nearly 1/3 of Maruyama's entire southern force. The elite 2nd Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. General Maruyama ordered a general retreat back into the jungle. The survivors had to crawl back along the same Maruyama trail that had nearly killed them. They had no food left. They had no medicine for the thousands of wounded men. Hundreds more died on the retreat from infection, starvation, and exhaustion. The American losses were staggeringly low in comparison. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and the 164th Infantry suffered fewer than 100 casualties. The kill ratio was nearly 20 to 1. The decisive battle had been a one-sided execution. The Japanese high command in Rabaul was in a state of total disbelief. They could not understand how their finest veterans had been broken by soft Americans. The myth of Japanese spiritual superiority had been shattered on the Lunga Wire. The soldiers who survived the battle began to call the island of death. The Japanese military term for the island shifted from Guadalcanal to Starvation Island. Henderson Field remained firmly in American hands. The Cactus Air Force began taking off again as the sun dried the runway. The Japanese 17th Army would never launch another major offensive on the island. The back of the Imperial Japanese ground force was broken. The morning light revealed the cold reality of modern war. Spirit cannot defeat a machine gun that never stops firing. The failure at Henderson Field was not just a tactical mistake. It was a failure of the entire Japanese military philosophy. General Hyakutake and General Maruyama prioritized seishin, or spirit, over logistics. They believed that courage could replace heavy artillery and food. The Americans proved that modern war is won with firepower and supply. The Marines did not win because they were braver than the Japanese. They won because they had water-cooled Brownings, M1 Garens, and 105mm howitzers. They won because they had a logistical system that could deliver ammo in a storm. The Sendai Division were victims of a profound doctrine gap. They trained for a war that only existed in their manuals. The Americans were fighting a war of attrition powered by the factory floor. Every time a Marine pulled the trigger, he was backed by the entire GDP of the United States. The Japanese soldier was backed only by his own hunger and his courage. This imbalance was not just unfair, it was a mathematical certainty of defeat. The Lunga perimeter was not just a line in the sand. It was the border between a medieval empire and a modern superpower. The Japanese relied on a single-strike victory. When the initial banzai charge failed, they had no plan B. They lacked the radio coordination to adapt to the changing battlefield. The Maruyama Trail proved that geography is an enemy that cannot be ignored. After October 1942, Japan shifted to a defensive strategy across the Pacific. They realized they could no longer outproduce or outfight the American machine. Henderson Field became a symbol of American industrial and tactical dominance. It was the turning point where the initiative passed permanently to the Allies. The Sendai Division was the elite vanguard of an empire that was now on the retreat. The lesson of Guadalcanal was simple and brutal. In the age of the machine, the factory always defeats the bayonet. The assault on Henderson Field remains a masterclass in how to lose a battle through poor planning. Japan sacrificed its most prestigious division to capture a dirt runway it can no longer hold. The failure of the Maruyama Trail and the lack of coordination were fatal errors. John Basilone and Chesty Puller became legends, but the real victor was the integrated defense system. Guadalcanal was the graveyard of Japanese ambition in the South Pacific. It was the place where the invincible sun began to set. If you found this breakdown of the Pacific's most lopsided battle insightful, hit the like button. Subscribe to join us as we explore the tactical turning points of World War II. Leave a comment below. Do you think the Japanese could have won if they had moved their heavy artillery through the jungle? Thanks for watching.